In 1274, the largest army in the world looked at an island in the Pacific Ocean and saw only a formality. They had destroyed entire civilizations on 3 continents. They had erased Baghdad in 13 days. They had swept medieval European knights like dry leaves. They had never lost a continental campaign. Japan was an isolated island without allies and without experience of foreign war. 900 ships, 33,000 soldiers, and an empire accustomed to winning everything that crossed its path. What happened next? Redefine forever what it means to face an enemy that is not afraid to die. In the year of 1274, planet Earth was ruled by fear. Not just any fear, but the fear of a single name. In less than 60 years, the Mongol Empire had devoured territories of dimensions that no previous civilization had even dreamed of controlling. From the Pacific coast to the borders of Central Europe, a single lineage of conquest had rewritten the map of the known world. Modern historians estimate that approximately 10% of the total human population of the planet was eliminated during the Mongol expansion campaigns. No previous military force in documented history came close to that number. Kublai Khan was not a man of impulses. He was a methodical strategist who had observed each previous campaign of his grandfather Genghis Khan and his predecessors with almost academic precision. When he decided to turn his eyes to Japan, he had already tried the diplomatic route for more than a decade. Between 1266 and 1272, he sent at least 5 formal missives demanding the voluntary submission of the Kamakura shogunate. Each message returned without response. The Japanese shogunate read the letters, deliberated, and made the choice that very few nations in that century would have the audacity to make. It completely ignored the man who had conquered China. The Japanese decision not to respond to Kublai Khan's letters was, from the logical point of view of the time, a bet with an almost impossible outcome. No nation that had ignored the Mongol demands in that way had survived to document the experience. Persia had tried to resist. Russia had tried to resist. The Abbasid Caliphate had tried to resist. The results were recorded in empty cities and in reports from foreign ambassadors who described the ruins in tones of clinical shock. The Kamakura shogunate, however, operated within a value system where death with honor was categorically superior to survival through submission. This philosophical distinction was about to create one of the most asymmetrical confrontations in documented military history. To understand what was about to happen in Hakata Bay, it is necessary to understand precisely what the Mongol army was at the technical level. It was not a disorganized horde of nomadic horsemen. By the year of 1274, it was the most technologically advanced military force on the planet. Kublai had absorbed the most sophisticated military engineers from every civilization he had conquered: Persian siege engine engineers, Chinese gunpowder specialists, technology that Europe would not know for another 50 years, Korean navigators, and shipbuilders. The army preparing to cross the Tsushima Strait was not only numerous, it was the military synthesis of 3 continents. On the other side of the strait, Japan prepared in the only way it knew. There was no contingency plan for gunpowder weapons because no one in the Japanese archipelago knew that gunpowder weapons existed. There were no studies of collective formation tactics because Japanese wars were fought under completely different rules. Rules that made individual dueling the moral core of every battle. The initial defender of Tsushima Island was a man named Sukekuni. He had under his direct command approximately 80 samurai. When the first ships of the Mongol Armada appeared on the horizon, Sukekuni did not retreat to a defensive position. He took boats and went out to meet the fleet. 80 men heading toward 900 ships. The gesture was not tactical, it was philosophical. On the morning of the 19th of October, in 1274, the Mongol fleet crossed the strait between the Korean Peninsula and Tsushima Island, 900 ships. The crossing operation took hours. From the Tsushima shoreline, Any observer who existed at that moment would have seen the horizon gradually darken. Not with clouds, but with sails. The armada covered the horizon from end to end. There was no visual precedent for that in Japan. No report. No oral tradition. No Buddhist or Shinto text had prepared the defenders for the scale of that spectacle. The sea had transformed into a city, and the city was moving toward the coast. Sukekuni had gathered his 80 samurai. The decision to go out to sea in boats to intercept the fleet before landing was not recklessness. It was doctrine. The warrior philosophy of Bushido, established with clarity that waiting for the enemy in a defensive position was in itself a form of moral defeat. The warrior goes to meet danger. He does not flee from it. Sukekuni advanced with his men in adapted fishing boats toward the vanguard of the armada. From the Mongol point of view, that vessel with 80 men approaching did not represent a threat. It represented an error of assessment on the part of the adversary. From Sukekuni's point of view, the action was the only possible response that his cultural formation had prepared for that moment. Both sides were right within their own systems of reality. Only one of those systems was about to be extinguished. The main landing occurred in Hakata Bay, in the north of Kyushu Island. The defensive heart of Japan, the bay was geographically the worst possible choice for the Japanese defenders' shallow water, flat coast, without natural obstructions that would prevent a mass landing. Rice fields stretched immediately behind the coastline. The Japanese army awaiting the arrival of the armada was estimated between 6,000 and 10,000 warriors, a considerable force for the standards of the archipelago, mobilized in record time. They were positioned on the beach and on the nearby elevations with samurai cavalry in the front line. They had been trained their entire lives for that moment. And when the armada finally entered the bay, what the samurai felt was not fear. It was something more disturbing, deep confusion about the rules of what was about to happen. The moment of cultural shock happened before any physical contact. When the Japanese armies positioned themselves for combat, there existed a sacred and immutable protocol. A high lineage warrior advanced alone in front of his army, stopped before the enemy, and in a loud voice declared his name, the name of his father, of his grandfather, his battle feats, and his bloodline, a speech that could last several minutes. It was a formal invitation to a singular duel between warriors of equal dignity. That was how Japanese wars had begun for centuries. The practice was so fundamental to Japanese warrior culture that it had its own name, Nanori. The samurai who advanced that day in Hakata Bay declared his name to the wind, to the Mongol army, and to the October sky. The Mongols had never heard of it and had no interest whatsoever in listening. What followed the ignored Nanori was the first armed contact between the two armies, and it was equally disorienting for the samurai. The Japanese cavalry advanced in dueling groups, each warrior seeking a worthy adversary for single combat. The Mongols responded in the only way they knew: collective formation, shields locked side by side in a continuous wall. Archers behind firing in coordinated volleys by horns and drums. Deafening noise incomprehensible to the Japanese who fought battles in ritual silence. Then came the Tetsuhao, the ceramic and iron bombs exploding in the air above the Japanese lines with a bang that surviving reports describe as artificial thunder. The Japanese horses, animals never exposed to explosions, entered immediate behavioral collapse. Riders trained for decades were thrown to the ground by their own mounts. The battle was only beginning, and the samurai were already in completely unknown territory. When the sun began to decline over Hakata Bay on that 19th of October, the Mongol army had conquered the beach. The samurai had retreated to the elevations behind the coastline, not in disordered flight, but in deliberate, tactical withdrawal, regrouping forces for the next day's combat. From the Mongol point of view, the battle had gone exactly as expected. Superior technology had worked, collective formation had worked, the bombs had worked. Veterans of 3 continents of conquest recognized that pattern: initial resistance, withdrawal, gradual collapse. Japan was following the same script as Persia. As Russia, as northern China, only the necessary time was missing to complete the process. The Mongol commanders then made a decision that seemed completely rational within their accumulated experience. They re-embarked the troops on the ships to spend the night. Standard protocol. Prevention of nighttime ambushes. A choice that had worked in dozens of previous campaigns. The meteorology of the Japanese archipelago in October is determined by a system of climatic fronts coming from the East China Sea. The storms that swept Japan at that time of year were not rare or unpredictable phenomena. For those who inhabited the islands, they were part of the calendar. The fishermen of Tsushima and Kyushu knew them by the behavior of the wind hours before their arrival, by the specific coloration of the sky at dusk, by the drop in atmospheric pressure that animals detected before humans. What the Mongol naval commanders did not know, because none of them had sailed those waters before, was that Hakata Bay, with its shallow bottom and its open entrance to the northwest, was a perfect geographic trap for northwest winds. And the winds that night came exactly from the northwest, hours after the fleet anchored. The first signs began to appear in the behavior of the water. The storm hit Hakata Bay in the early morning. The Japanese historical records, in particular the Hachiman Gudokun written decades later, describe winds that made it impossible to stand on deck and waves that completely covered the smaller ships. For the Mongol fleet, anchored in shallow waters with ships densely grouped, what followed was a slow-motion engineering catastrophe. The flat-bottom ships, designed for rivers and protected coasts, did not have the deep keel necessary for stability in agitated open sea. When the waves began to push the hulls sideways, the construction structure did not support the applied forces. Ships were thrown against adjacent ships. Anchors broke. Hulls collided repeatedly until the wooden structures gave way. Water entered and kept entering. From the Japanese perspective, what had happened in Hakata Bay during the night could only be assessed at dawn on the 20th of October. When the samurai descended from the elevated positions to the coast and observed the state of the Mongol fleet, what they found was simultaneously a victory and an enigma. The armada had been devastated, not by the Japanese sword, but by something completely outside human control. The surviving Mongols, in a critical situation of supplies and with their ships damaged, took the only available decision to re-embark those who remained and withdraw the invasion force back to Korea. From the Japanese strategic point of view, the result was technically a successful defense of the territory. From the spiritual and philosophical point of view, which was the only point of view that truly mattered for the samurai culture of the period, something much greater had occurred. The gods had intervened, the wind had been sent, Japan had been protected by a force that transcended human war. The word that the Japanese would goja used to describe the wind that destroyed the Mongol fleet. That October night was officially recorded only decades later, when the second Mongol invasion of 1281 was equally destroyed by a devastating storm. It was then that the concept crystallized in the Japanese language and spirituality with a permanence that would survive 700 years. Kamikaze. Divine wind. The belief that Japan was protected by forces beyond human comprehension, beyond the capacity of any army to destroy. The documented historical irony is that Kublai Khan did not interpret the defeat in the same way. He did not see an act of the gods. He saw a problem of naval engineering and climatic timing. He immediately planned a third expedition that never departed. The wind of 1274 did not end the Mongol ambition. It only postponed it. But Japan had survived and now had a name to explain why. The defeat of 1274 did not end Kublai Khan's ambition over Japan. It ended only the first attempt. From the point of view of the Great Khan, what had occurred in Hakata Bay was a logistical problem with an identifiable solution: inadequate ships, wrong climatic timing, insufficient force. The answer was to scale up. Between 1274 and 1281, Kublai Khan built the largest amphibious invasion force in history. Up to that point, 150,000 soldiers, 4,400 ships, two separate fleets, one departing from China, the other from Korea, coordinated to converge simultaneously on Japan. The logistical operation to assemble that force took 7 years. Kublai had learned something from the first invasion, what he had not learned, because no amount of naval engineering could teach, was that Japan had an ally that did not appear on any campaign map. The second Mongol invasion arrived in June of 1281. The Korean fleet landed first, this time encountering a radically different Japanese defense. The stone coastal wall that had been built along the entire length of Hakata Bay in the 7 years. Since the first invasion, the samurai now fought behind a defensive structure. They had studied the Mongol tactics. They had adapted their formations for collective combat, absorbing the lessons of 1274 in the only way the samurai culture knew how to absorb lessons, transforming defeat into discipline. For weeks, the Mongol forces tried to consolidate a position on firm land without success. The wall worked. The samurai had changed. The Chinese fleet arrived late. And then, in August of 1281, Japan summoned the wind for the second time. The typhoon of August 1281 was considerably more violent than the storm of 1274. Contemporary Chinese and Japanese historical sources describe winds and waves of catastrophic magnitude that struck the Mongol fleet anchored in Hakata Bay and in the surrounding waters during 2 continuous days. The Chinese fleet, which had arrived late and was anchored in exposed waters outside the bay, was especially devastated. Modern historical estimates based on surviving documentary sources suggest that between half and 2/3 of the total invasion force was destroyed by the storm. Between 75,000 and 100,000 men eliminated in 2 days by a meteorological event. No battle recorded in human history up to that point had produced human losses in 2 days, comparable to what the wind of August 1281 accomplished over Kublai Khan's Second Armada. What had been called kamikaze in 1274 had returned, and this time had left no doubts about its intention. Kublai Khan planned a third expedition. The historical documents of the Yuan court record discussions about a new invasion of Japan in the years following 1281. The Third Armada never departed. The reasons were multiple and simultaneous. The devastating economic cost of the 2 previous campaigns had strained the empire's finances to a point close to rupture. The rebellions of the subjugated peoples, in particular the continuous resistance in Vietnam and other regions of Southeast Asia, demanded urgent military attention. And there was an internal perception problem that no naval engineer could solve. Japan had defeated the Mongol Empire twice, not militarily in the conventional sense, but it had defeated the narrative of Mongol invincibility, which was in itself a fundamental strategic weapon. The psychological terror that made armies retreat before combat had been fractured by an island, by 2 winds. Kublai Khan died in 1294 without having achieved the conquest of Japan. The archipelago remained until the end, beyond the reach of the greatest empire that humanity had ever built. What the Battle of Tsushima and the subsequent invasion of Hakata left for history goes far beyond the immediate military outcome. Japan was the only territory that the Mongol Empire, at its peak, tried to conquer and failed to subjugate. This distinction is unique in 7 decades of Mongol expansion. It profoundly shaped the collective Japanese psychology, the conviction that the archipelago was protected by forces beyond human reach, a belief that persisted and transformed over centuries, resurfacing in radically different contexts with the same name, kamikaze. The human cost for Japan was real and significant. The victory was not free, but the narrative that survived, that of the wind that saved the islands twice, revealed something deeper about how cultures process events that exceed the capacity of human agency to explain. The samurai who survived Hakata Bay did not claim the victory for themselves. They attributed it to the wind. This choice to return the credit to the inexplicable says more about the philosophy that had built that warrior culture than any tactical detail of the battle could ever reveal.